The meeting was scheduled for 3:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. I remember the exact time because I had been tracking productivity metrics all afternoon, preparing for what I assumed would be a discussion about my promotion to senior director. Instead, Richard Chambers, our senior VP of operations, delivered what he clearly considered career guidance. I was not executive material. He said this while reviewing my annual performance evaluation, the same document that highlighted my cost-saving initiatives totaling over $500,000 for the fiscal year. The irony wasn't lost on me, though I suspect it sailed right past Richard. He seemed particularly focused on what he termed my lack of strategic vision, a phrase he repeated 3 times during our 30-minute conversation. I nodded appropriately, took notes, asked clarifying questions about areas for improvement, standard protocol for receiving feedback, even when that feedback contradicts objective reality. What Richard didn't know was that I had spent the previous 6 months quietly documenting performance patterns across our entire management structure. Call it professional curiosity, or perhaps professional insurance. When you work for 15 years building expertise in operational efficiency, you develop certain observational habits. The numbers told an interesting story. 3 weeks later, I submitted my formal response to the performance review. Nothing dramatic, simply a comprehensive analysis of departmental productivity metrics, cross-referenced with leadership effectiveness indicators I had been tracking. The data painted a clear picture of who was actually driving results within our organization. Richard's reaction was immediate and visible. Let me back up 6 months to provide proper context. Our company had been struggling with operational inefficiencies that were bleeding resources at an alarming rate. Manufacturing delays, supply chain disruptions, inventory management failures. The kind of systematic problems that don't resolve themselves through wishful thinking or inspirational leadership seminars. I had identified the root cause within my first week of analysis. We were treating symptoms while ignoring the underlying disease. Our procurement processes were antiquated, our vendor relationships were poorly managed, and our quality control procedures were more theatrical than functional. The solution required restructuring our entire supply chain management system. Not the sort of glamorous project that generates executive visibility, but absolutely essential for long-term sustainability. I submitted a detailed proposal to Richard in January, complete with implementation timeline and projected cost savings. He filed it away for future consideration. By March, I had implemented several pilot programs within my department. Small-scale tests of the larger systems I knew we needed, nothing that required executive approval or significant budget allocation. Just intelligent application of existing resources. The results were immediate. Production efficiency increased by 12%. Quality control issues dropped by 38%. Vendor response times improved dramatically. Most importantly, we were saving money. Substantial amounts of money. I documented everything meticulously. Every process improvement, every cost reduction, every efficiency gain. Spreadsheets, graphs, trend analyses. The complete picture of what systematic operational improvement could accomplish. Richard noticed the numbers, of course. They were hard to ignore when quarterly reports showed our department consistently outperforming projections. He even mentioned my contributions during the executive team meetings, according to colleagues who attended those sessions. But recognition and understanding are different things entirely. When I requested a meeting in June to discuss expanding the pilot programs company-wide, Richard seemed genuinely puzzled by my initiative. He appreciated my enthusiasm, he said, but these were decisions that required executive-level strategic thinking. Perhaps I should focus on maintaining the improvements we had already achieved rather than pursuing additional complexity. I maintained my documentation practices, professional habit at that point. By September, my department's cost savings had reached the $500,000 mark. Other departments were requesting consultations about implementing similar improvements. The operations team was citing our processes as best practice examples. Even our external auditors commented on the remarkable efficiency gains they observed during their quarterly review. Richard scheduled my annual performance review for October. I prepared thoroughly as always, compiled all the documentation from the previous 12 months, organized the data into clear, comprehensive presentations, created visual aids that would make the story obvious even to someone who hadn't lived through the daily implementation details. The meeting was scheduled for 3:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. I had expected recognition, perhaps some acknowledgement of the measurable value I had created for the organization, possibly even a discussion about expanding my responsibilities to match my demonstrated capabilities. Instead, Richard explained that executive material required different qualities than operational competence. Vision, he emphasized, leadership presence, strategic thinking at the organizational level rather than tactical execution at the departmental level. He seemed genuinely convinced that saving $500,000 represented tactical thinking. I asked for specific examples of strategic initiatives I should pursue to develop executive-level capabilities. Richard suggested I observe how senior leadership approach complex problems, study their decision-making processes, learn to think beyond immediate operational concerns. The irony was remarkable, though I kept that observation to myself. During this conversation, I had a moment of clarity about my situation. Richard wasn't evaluating my performance against objective criteria. He was comparing my approach to his own preferred leadership style. And since my methods differed from his methods, he concluded that my methods were somehow deficient. This realization was professionally liberating. I thanked him for the feedback and assured him I would incorporate his suggestions into my development planning. Standard corporate diplomacy. Meanwhile, my mind was already working through the implications of what I had just learned. Richard valued perception over performance, style over substance, executive presence over executive results, and he was evaluating everyone else using the same criteria. The following week, I began a comprehensive review of performance data across our entire management structure. Not just my department, but every operational unit within the company. I wanted to understand how Richard's evaluation criteria were being applied consistently throughout the organization. The pattern was fascinating. Managers who generated impressive presentation materials received higher ratings than managers who generated impressive results. Directors who participated actively in strategic planning sessions were rated more favorably than directors who implemented those plans effectively. Vice presidents who communicated vision statements received better evaluations than vice presidents who achieved measurable objectives. Richard was rewarding the appearance of executive capability while overlooking actual executive performance. I spent 3 weeks compiling this analysis, cross-referencing performance metrics with evaluation scores, identifying correlations between subjective leadership assessments and objective operational outcomes, building a comprehensive picture of how our performance review system actually functioned versus how it was supposed to function. The results were professionally illuminating and personally motivating. Richard had given me mediocre ratings across multiple categories, where my performance was objectively superior to colleagues who received excellent ratings in those same categories. Meanwhile, those same colleagues were struggling with basic operational challenges that I had resolved months earlier. Our procurement director, who received outstanding marks for strategic vision, had overseen vendor relationship disasters that cost us significant money and credibility. Our manufacturing VP, praised for executive presence, had failed to address quality control problems that were generating customer complaints and product returns. Our logistics manager, commended for leadership potential, was consistently missing delivery targets that affected customer satisfaction scores. Yet all of them were considered executive material while I was not. I realized that Richard's evaluation of my capabilities said more about Richard than it said about me. This insight fundamentally changed my approach to the situation. Instead of trying to develop whatever qualities Richard thought I was missing, I decided to demonstrate exactly what those missing qualities were costing the organization. My formal response to the performance review was submitted on November 15th. I kept it professional, constructive, and thoroughly documented. No accusations or complaints, simply an objective analysis of operational performance across our management structure, with particular attention to the correlation between leadership evaluations and measurable results. I included detailed comparisons showing how departments with highly rated managers were actually performing relative to departments with lower rated managers. The data revealed systematic patterns that challenged conventional assumptions about what constituted effective leadership within our organization. The analysis was particularly revealing regarding cost management and efficiency improvements. Departments led by managers who received recognition for strategic thinking were consistently underperforming in areas where strategic thinking should have produced measurable advantages. Meanwhile, departments that were achieving superior results were often led by managers who received lukewarm evaluations for their leadership potential. I presented this information without editorial comment. No suggestions about what the data might mean or what actions should be taken based on these findings. Just clean, comprehensive analysis that spoke for itself. Richard's initial reaction was predictably defensive. He scheduled a follow-up meeting to discuss my response, which he characterized as unnecessarily complex and potentially divisive. He seemed concerned that my analysis might create confusion about our evaluation processes or undermine confidence in leadership assessments. During our conversation, he emphasized that performance reviews were designed to evaluate potential rather than just current results. Executive material, he explained again, required capabilities that weren't always reflected in short-term operational metrics. Vision and leadership presence were long-term investments that would pay dividends over time, even if they didn't generate immediate measurable returns. I acknowledged his perspective while maintaining that measurable returns were still worth measuring. The interesting part of this conversation was what Richard didn't say. He never challenged the accuracy of my analysis or disputed any of the performance comparisons I had documented. His concerns were entirely about presentation and perception rather than substance and accuracy. This told me everything I needed to know about how to proceed. Over the following weeks, word of my performance review response began circulating among colleagues. Not through any initiative on my part, but through the natural dynamics of organizational communication. People were curious about what I had submitted that had generated such an extended discussion with senior leadership. Several department heads requested copies of my analysis for their own reference. They were particularly interested in the methodology I had used for cross-departmental performance comparisons and the metrics I had selected for measuring leadership effectiveness. Some mentioned that they were experiencing similar disconnects between their own performance evaluations and their actual operational results. By December, my analysis had become something of an unofficial reference document for understanding organizational performance patterns. Managers were using it to benchmark their own results against company-wide standards and to identify areas where their operational approaches might need adjustment. Richard was not pleased with this development. He called a special management meeting to address what he described as misunderstandings about performance evaluation criteria. The session was ostensibly educational, designed to clarify how leadership assessments were conducted and why certain qualities were prioritized over others in determining executive potential. The meeting was revealing in ways that Richard probably didn't intend. His presentation focused heavily on the importance of vision, strategic thinking, and executive presence. He emphasized that operational results were certainly valuable, but that true leadership required capabilities that transcended immediate tactical concerns. Executive material, he repeated, demonstrated ability to think beyond current limitations and inspire others toward future possibilities. During the question and answer session, several managers asked for specific examples of how vision and strategic thinking translated into measurable outcomes. They wanted to understand the connection between leadership presence and operational performance. They were curious about metrics for evaluating executive potential versus executive results. Richard's responses were notably abstract. He spoke eloquently about leadership philosophy and organizational culture, but struggled to provide concrete examples of how his preferred leadership qualities generated tangible value for the company. When pressed for specifics, he tended to redirect conversations toward general principles rather than particular applications. The contrast was striking. Here was a senior executive who could discuss leadership theory extensively, but couldn't clearly articulate how that theory produced practical benefits. Meanwhile, managers throughout the room were dealing with daily operational challenges that required immediate, measurable solutions. Several attendees referenced my performance analysis during their questions, using it as a framework for understanding the relationship between leadership evaluation and operational outcomes. They seemed genuinely interested in bridging the gap between theoretical leadership qualities and practical leadership results. Richard's discomfort with these references was obvious, though he maintained professional composure throughout the session. Following the management meeting, I began receiving informal requests from colleagues who wanted assistance with their own performance documentation. They had observed the attention my analysis had generated and were interested in applying similar methodologies to their own situations. I helped where I could, always maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. I shared analytical techniques, suggested performance metrics, provided templates for data organization. Nothing that violated confidential information or undermined organizational protocols. Simply professional colleagues assisting each other with legitimate business analysis. The cumulative effect was remarkable. Within 6 weeks, nearly every department had developed comprehensive performance documentation that provided objective measurement of leadership effectiveness. Managers throughout the company were tracking the same metrics I had been using, creating a standardized framework for understanding operational results across our entire organization. This created an interesting situation for Richard during the next quarterly review cycle. Executive leadership now had access to detailed, comparable performance data from every operational unit. The information I had originally compiled for my individual performance review had evolved into a company-wide management assessment system. And the patterns that had been visible in my initial analysis were now undeniably obvious across the entire organizational structure. Departments that were achieving superior operational results were led by managers who had received lukewarm leadership evaluations. Units that were struggling with basic performance challenges were managed by people who had been praised for their executive potential. The correlation was consistent, measurable, and professionally embarrassing for anyone who had championed evaluation criteria that ignored actual results. Richard found himself in the position of defending leadership assessments that were contradicted by organizational performance data. His emphasis on vision and strategic thinking looked increasingly theoretical when compared to the practical achievements of managers he had dismissed as lacking executive material. The quarterly executive review meeting was scheduled for January 15th. I wasn't invited, of course, but colleagues who attended described it as professionally uncomfortable for Richard. He was required to present departmental performance results that consistently challenged his own evaluation criteria. My department's numbers were particularly compelling. We had exceeded efficiency targets by 18%, reduced operational costs by an additional $100,000, and achieved quality metrics that were being adopted as company-wide standards. Other departments were requesting consultation on implementing our processes. External vendors were citing our partnership approach as their preferred model for client relationships. Yet, according to Richard's evaluation system, I lacked the executive qualities necessary for senior leadership responsibilities. The cognitive dissonance was becoming impossible to ignore. During February, I received an unexpected request from our Chief Operating Officer. She wanted to discuss expanding my operational improvement initiatives to additional business units. Apparently, the executive team had been reviewing departmental performance data and had identified our processes as particularly effective models for organizational efficiency. The conversation was professionally gratifying. She was clearly familiar with my work and understood the technical details of what we had accomplished. More importantly, she grasped the strategic implications of systematic operational improvement and wanted to explore how those principles could be applied more broadly throughout the company. We discussed implementation timelines, resource requirements, and success metrics. She asked detailed questions about methodologies, potential obstacles, and scalability considerations. The conversation focused entirely on practical concerns rather than abstract leadership philosophy. At the end of our meeting, she mentioned that my performance analysis from the previous year had been instrumental in helping executive leadership understand operational performance patterns across the organization. They had been particularly impressed with the analytical rigor and the actionable insights the documentation provided. She also mentioned almost casually that there might be opportunities for expanded responsibilities in the coming months. 2 weeks later, Richard announced his decision to pursue opportunities outside the company. His departure was described as mutual agreement with executive leadership about strategic direction and organizational fit. Professional language that everyone understood meant he had been encouraged to find alternative employment. His replacement was announced the following month. Our new Senior Vice President of Operations had an extensive background in process improvement and operational excellence. Her first initiative was implementing systematic performance measurement across all departments, using methodologies that looked remarkably similar to the analysis framework I had developed. She scheduled individual meetings with all department heads during her first week. When we met, she was thoroughly familiar with my operational results and seemed particularly interested in the documentation practices I had developed. She asked thoughtful questions about metric selection, data collection procedures, and analytical methodologies. The conversation was refreshingly different from my interactions with Richard. She understood the technical aspects of what I had accomplished and appreciated the strategic value of systematic operational improvement. More importantly, she recognized the correlation between measurable results and leadership effectiveness. During our discussion, she mentioned that executive leadership was considering organizational restructuring to better align responsibilities with demonstrated capabilities. There might be opportunities for people who had proven their ability to generate measurable value for the company. 3 months later, I was promoted to Senior Director of Operational Excellence, with expanded responsibilities for process improvement across multiple business units. The position came with significant budget authority, direct access to executive leadership, and mandate to implement systematic efficiency initiatives throughout the organization. My first project was developing company-wide performance measurement standards that would ensure leadership evaluations were based on objective results rather than subjective impressions. The methodology I created was adapted from the analysis framework I had originally developed for my own performance review response. The irony was professionally satisfying, though I kept that satisfaction to myself. Within 6 months, our company had implemented comprehensive performance tracking that provided clear visibility into leadership effectiveness at every level. Managers were evaluated based on measurable outcomes rather than perceived potential. Promotion decisions were supported by objective data rather than subjective impressions. Executive development focused on practical capabilities rather than theoretical qualities. The cultural change was remarkable. People throughout the organization began focusing on results rather than appearances. Operational improvement became a priority rather than an afterthought. Efficiency initiatives were recognized and rewarded rather than dismissed as tactical concerns. Company performance improved dramatically. Costs continued declining while productivity increased across all departments. Customer satisfaction scores reached record levels. Employee engagement surveys showed significant improvement in workplace satisfaction. External auditors consistently praised our operational excellence and systematic approach to continuous improvement. Executive leadership was particularly pleased with the financial results. Our operational improvements had generated over $2 million in cost savings during the first year of company-wide implementation. The return on investment for systematic performance measurement was impossible to ignore. During my first annual review in the new position, our Chief Operating Officer specifically commended my strategic vision and executive leadership capabilities. She noted that my approach to organizational improvement demonstrated exactly the kind of long-term thinking that characterized effective senior management. The conversation was professionally validating, though not entirely surprising. I had been demonstrating those same capabilities for years. The difference was that now I was working with leadership who recognized practical results as evidence of strategic thinking rather than evidence of tactical limitation. Looking back on the experience, I realized that Richard's evaluation of my capabilities was technically accurate within his own framework. I didn't possess the qualities he associated with executive material. I was focused on measurable results rather than inspirational vision. I prioritized practical solutions over theoretical possibilities. I demonstrated leadership through systematic improvement rather than charismatic presence. What Richard failed to understand was that his framework was fundamentally flawed. Executive material should be defined by executive results, not executive appearance. Leadership effectiveness should be measured by organizational outcomes, not personal impressions. Strategic thinking should be evaluated based on strategic achievements, not strategic presentations. My response to his performance evaluation wasn't designed to prove him wrong about my capabilities. It was designed to demonstrate that his evaluation criteria were wrong about leadership effectiveness. The analysis I submitted showed that our organization's most successful managers were the ones who were being undervalued by his assessment system, while our least effective managers were the ones being praised for their executive potential. The subsequent changes in organizational culture, performance measurement, and leadership development vindicated not just my individual capabilities, but my fundamental approach to understanding what makes leadership effective. The results spoke for themselves, which was always the point. These days, when I review performance evaluations for people in my organization, I focus primarily on measurable outcomes. Vision and strategic thinking are certainly important, but they must be demonstrated through practical results rather than theoretical discussions. Executive presence matters, but it means the presence of actual executive capabilities rather than the appearance of executive qualities. I've learned that true professional vindication doesn't come from proving critics wrong about your limitations. It comes from proving that their understanding of your profession was limited. Richard wasn't wrong to think I lacked the qualities he valued. He was wrong to think those qualities were what actually mattered. The most satisfying aspect of this experience wasn't my personal promotion or the recognition of my capabilities. It was seeing our entire organization develop better methods for identifying and developing genuine leadership talent. People throughout the company now have opportunities to advance based on their actual contributions rather than their perceived potential. That's the kind of strategic thinking that produces lasting organizational value. And it's exactly the kind of executive material our company needed all along. Sometimes the best response to being told you're not executive material is demonstrating what executive material actually looks like. The results have a way of speaking for themselves, provided you document them properly and present them at the right time to the right audience. Professional vindication is ultimately about professional standards rather than personal satisfaction. When those standards are applied consistently and objectively, Capable people tend to be recognized for their capabilities. It just takes patience, documentation, and the occasional comprehensive performance analysis to make that recognition inevitable. The meeting was scheduled for 3:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, and it changed everything. Not because Richard was right about my limitations, but because he was wrong about what leadership actually requires. And sometimes that's the most valuable lesson of all.